The astrolabe glided through the darkness of space, its sleek body cutting through the void, surrounded by stars in every direction. Captain Celine Armitage stood at the observation window, staring into the cold abyss. The ship's hum echoed in the background, a rhythmic sound that comforted her in times of tension. This was it, the moment that would define humanity's future among the stars. Behind her, the low murmur of her crew filled the bridge. Their unease was palpable, even if they tried to mask it. Zenith, the Terithian high navigator who had accompanied them, stood in the corner of the room, his cold, multifaceted eyes watching every movement with a mix of curiosity and disdain. His species, ancient and methodical, had always been masters of navigation, relying on complex algorithms and precise computations. They took days, sometimes weeks, to chart a course through the stars. And then there was Celine. She had always been different, even when she was just a child, staring at the night sky. While other students in her class studied the mathematical precision of star systems, Celine had learned the stars themselves, how to feel the pull of a distant constellation, how to understand the ebb and flow of the universe, without relying on anything more than the stars and her instincts. Today, she would prove that to the galaxy. "Captain," a voice crackled over the comms. It was First Officer Kale, his voice steady but with a hint of nervousness. "We're approaching the first waypoint. We'll need to plot a new course through the asteroid belt ahead." Celine glanced at the star chart displayed on the console. Her eyes flicked from the digital map to the starry field outside. The asteroid belt loomed ahead, a dense cluster of rocks and debris that no ship had safely navigated without detailed computational analysis. The Tyrithians had given them a week to navigate this unknown sector, but Celine had no intention of taking that long. They had tested her before, scrutinizing her methods, her skill, and her judgment. Now was the time to show them that humanity's ability to adapt was far more advanced than the Tyrithians ever realized. She turned to the crew. "Plot a course, then," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. "What's the plan, Captain?" Kale asked, his tone hesitant. He knew Celine's methods. She wasn't one to use the ship's full navigational system unless absolutely necessary. "I'll do it," Celine said. "We're going to chart our path using the stars. I've studied this sector for years. I know the way." Zenith's antennae twitched as he moved closer. His voice was measured, cold. "You plan to navigate this system based on intuition? The method is primitive, unscientific. The asteroid belt ahead will require calculations beyond your abilities." Celine didn't look at him, though she could feel his eyes on her. "I've never needed more than the stars," she said simply. "We'll use their patterns, the pull of the gravitational fields, to guide us. I've plotted the course. We'll be fine." "Captain, it's a risk," Kale said, his brow furrowed. "We're talking about an asteroid belt that shifts unpredictably, full of debris. This is not a place where intuition is enough." "I'll be the judge of that," Celine said, her voice unwavering. She turned back to the console, tapping a few buttons to bring up the ancient charts she'd memorized years ago. The stars above were not random, they followed a rhythm, a cadence that Celine had spent years learning to read. While the Tyrithians would have spent hours, perhaps days, calculating the safest route, Celine could do it in minutes. The hum of the ship's engines shifted slightly as they approached the outer rim of the asteroid belt. The first rock appeared on the sensors, a large, tumbling mass of jagged stone, moving at a terrifying speed. Kale's eyes flicked nervously to the screen. "Do you see that?" Kale asked. "The belt's movement is unpredictable. One wrong turn and—" Celine held up a hand. "I see it," she said, her voice calm. She placed her fingers gently on the navigation controls, aligning them with the chart she'd memorized. She could feel the pull of the rocks, each one with its own tiny gravitational force. She didn't need the ship's full navigation system, she just needed the stars to guide her. Zenith's voice interrupted, icy as ever. "You cannot predict the path of the belt like this. It's foolishness." "Foolishness?" Celine's voice was cool. "Tell me, Zenith, how do your people calculate the unknown? Do you rely on what you can see, or do you sometimes just know? She paused, letting the silence stretch out. Sometimes, the answer is in the stars themselves. And I know how to read them. The ship's path veered slightly as Celine adjusted their trajectory, steering them around the first asteroid with ease. Her fingers danced across the console, charting a new course through the shifting belt. The rocks around them were large and dangerous, but she wasn't afraid. She didn't need a computer to tell her where the gravitation fields were, she felt it in her bones. Cale watched the monitor, his face a mixture of disbelief and awe. I can't believe it, he murmured. We're moving faster than expected. Zenith, however, didn't share the sentiment. His voice was full of skepticism. You cannot continue like this. The next cluster is worse. You'll fail. We'll see, Celine replied, her gaze focused on the path ahead. She adjusted their course again, and the astrolabe slid between two massive asteroids, their colossal forms just inches from the hull. Hold steady, she said to her crew. The ship's engines thrummed smoothly as they glided through the field, narrowly avoiding asteroid after asteroid. With each twist and turn, Zenith's disapproval grew. He paced the bridge, his movements sharp and agitated. This is madness. But Celine didn't flinch. Every move she made was deliberate. The stars told her what to do. She didn't need a map, she didn't need a computer. She had learned long ago to listen to the vast, silent language of the universe. Finally, they emerged from the asteroid field, the stars before them now clear and unbroken. The crew let out a collective breath, the tension breaking. Cale looked at Celine, his expression one of amazement. I can't believe you did it. We made it. Celine gave a small, satisfied smile. I told you. Zenith was silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his tone had changed, no longer condescending, but curious, almost respectful. Perhaps, there is more to your species than I gave credit for. Celine glanced at him, her eyes steady. We'll see, Zenith. We'll see. Navigating the unknown. The astrolabe had passed through the asteroid belt, the narrow escape leaving a buzz of excitement in the air. But Celine Armitage knew the easy part was over. Beyond the belt, a nebula stretched across the sky, its swirling colors both beautiful and ominous. A volatile region, full of gravitational anomalies, unstable energy fields, and unpredictable turbulence. The nebula was humanity's true test. Celine leaned over the console in the center of the bridge, her fingers moving swiftly as she mapped their course through the thick cloud of ionized gas. She wasn't worried about the unknown. The stars always gave her a way forward, an instinct she had honed since childhood. But as the astrolabe sailed deeper into the heart of the nebula, the tension in the air grew palpable. I don't like this, Cale said, his voice tight with anxiety. He stood beside her, watching the glowing readouts on the screen. The nebula's fields are shifting too quickly. Any misstep and we'll be caught in a wave of ion radiation. I've got it, Celine replied, her voice firm. She didn't need a display to tell her what the nebula was doing. Her hand hovered over the console, aligning the ship with the magnetic fields she could almost feel, a part of her. The stars might be hidden now, but they were still out there, guiding her. Zenith stood behind them, his massive form still as ever, his cold eyes narrowing as he examined the fluctuations on the sensors. His skepticism from earlier had deepened into something more, an almost palpable suspicion. The Terithian navigator had yet to express any admiration for Celine's methods, and he was growing increasingly irritated. You're moving us further into the heart of the nebula, Zenith finally said, his voice cold and detached. If your calculations are off by even a fraction, we'll be shredded by radiation and gravity. Celine glanced at him, her gaze unwavering. It's not about calculations, Zenith. It's about intuition. The nebula isn't random. There's a pattern to the turbulence, even if you can't see it. You rely on data. I rely on instinct. And right now, my instinct says we're fine. Zenith clicked his mandibles, clearly displeased. Instinct? That's a dangerous approach. Celine felt her jaw tighten but didn't respond. She was used to hearing that from the Tyrithians. They had no faith in anything that couldn't be measured, quantified, or predicted. For them, the universe was a vast equation, each variable carefully calculated. To them, humanity's ability to navigate by intuition was primitive, a relic of a bygone era. The Astrolabe surged forward, the ship now deep within the nebula. On the main view screen, the colors shifted, like a living thing, swirling in patterns Celine could almost read. A sudden jolt ran through the ship, throwing Kale off balance. The crew scrambled to maintain their footing as a shock wave of ion energy rippled through the nebula. "Hold steady," Celine barked, gripping the edge of the console. "This is exactly what I've been waiting for. Don't touch anything." "Captain, the readings," Kale started, but Celine interrupted him with a sharp glance. "I said don't touch anything." The turbulence increased, the ship rocking violently as invisible waves of energy slammed against the hull. The sensors on the bridge flickered, their readings erratic. Kale's hands hovered over the control panels, desperate to stabilize the ship, but Celine knew that trying to control the flow of the nebula would be a mistake. It was like fighting the ocean's current, an exercise in futility. Instead, she relaxed her grip and focused, letting herself tune into the rhythm of the nebula. The stars were out of view, but she could still feel them. The nebula had its own pulse, its own beat. Zenith stood watching, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering as the Astrolabe bucked and shuddered under the pressure. The Tyrithian had clearly grown more concerned, his normally steady demeanor slipping into frustration. "We're not going to survive this if we continue this course," he muttered, stepping forward. "You can't simply feel your way through this. This is not the wilds of Earth, Captain. This is space." Celine held her ground, her eyes fixed on the field of ionized particles. "You're right, Zenith. But sometimes, feeling is all we have. This is how humans have survived for centuries, by trusting our instincts when we can't see the path ahead." Her voice was calm, but there was a certainty in it that none of the Tyrithians had ever shown. She felt the space around her, like a map laid out in her mind, as though the nebula were speaking directly to her. She could sense the deep pockets of gravitational pull, the waves of energy that ran through the gas cloud, pushing and pulling like invisible hands. "I'm making a small adjustment," she said, and before Kale could protest, she gave the command. The Astrolabe shifted course slightly, gliding with the currents of the nebula rather than fighting them. The ship leaned into the turbulence rather than trying to escape it. "Hold tight," Celine murmured under her breath, her hands steady as she guided the ship through the waves. The ion radiation was increasing, but she knew the Astrolabe would hold up. It was built for this, built for the unknown. Zenith's chitinous features twitched, but he remained silent for a long time, watching the readings on his panel. The turbulence subsided just enough for them to regain some control. The nebula wasn't as chaotic as it first appeared, it had a rhythm, a beat. The key was to feel it, not fight it. And Celine was the only one who understood that. The crew stayed quiet as the ship continued through the nebula. Zenith seemed to be reconsidering his earlier disdain. Even he could see that Celine was guiding them through, and his frustration was beginning to fade into reluctant respect. The constant danger and unpredictability of the nebula had almost made the situation feel like an impossible mission. Yet, here they were, making progress, every turn a step closer to safety. Finally, as the last wave of energy hit, the Astrolabe emerged from the swirling clouds of gas. The stars above them returned to view, sharp and cold. The nebula, for all its menace, had been passed, just as Celine had known it would be. Kale exhaled a breath he didn't know he had been holding. "Captain," he said, his voice full of awe, "you did it. We made it through." Zenith said nothing for a long moment, but his silence spoke volumes. He turned to Celine, his voice quieter now, less condescending. "Your method is more effective than I anticipated." Celine turned to him, her expression softening slightly. "Sometimes, Zenith, the right path isn't the one with the straight lines. It's the one you feel in your gut." Zenith's eyes flickered, and for the first time, there was something like understanding in his gaze. He nodded once, but said no more. The crew felt the shift in the air, a quiet acknowledgement. They weren't just a ship lost in the nebula anymore. They were something more. They were proof that human ingenuity could navigate not only the stars but the very heart of the unknown. The final trial. The Astrolabe coasted through the outer rim of the nebula, the calm after the storm unsettling. The ship was no longer surrounded by the chaotic swirls of ionized gas. The stars ahead were clear, distant pinpricks of light that felt almost mocking in their tranquility. But Celine Armitage knew better than to feel relief. This was only the calm before the storm. There was one more test they had to pass, one that would determine if humanity had truly earned its place among the stars. They were headed toward the gravitational anomaly, a singularity that had baffled even the greatest minds of the galaxy. It was a riddle, a swirling mass of dark energy and matter that no ship had ever navigated without losing its course, or its crew. Celine knew the risks. But more than that, she knew this was where they would prove their worth. "This is it," Cale said, his voice tight as he looked out at the strange phenomenon looming ahead. The singularity's gravitational pull was already beginning to distort the light, creating a visual vortex that tugged at the ship's sensors. "We're close. The pull is getting stronger." "I can feel it," Celine replied, her eyes narrowing as she studied the anomaly. Her fingers brushed over the controls, but it wasn't her hands that were guiding the ship now, it was her mind, her instincts. She had trained for years, studying the behavior of cosmic bodies, and while most navigators would rely on calculations and algorithms, Celine had learned to read the subtle forces of the universe in ways others couldn't. Zenith had been silent since they'd left the nebula, but his presence loomed over them. He had stood at the helm, arms crossed, ever watchful, his eyes flicking to the readings on the console. He had remained reserved since their passage through the nebula, perhaps even more so now. He had never seen a human pilot navigate through a space so unpredictable, and his respect for Celine was grudging, yet undeniable. "You're taking us in too close," Zenith said suddenly, his voice low and filled with warning. "The pull of the singularity will tear us apart before we even get near it. It's too dangerous." Celine's jaw tightened. "I know what I'm doing. Trust me." "I don't trust this," Zenith muttered, his gaze darting between the readings and Celine's steady hands. "It's irrational." "Irrational," Celine echoed, eyes sharp. "If you want safety, stay at the back of the room. This is a human test, Zenith. We don't just survive by avoiding danger, we learn to face it." Cale, standing to the side, watched the exchange quietly. He had come to trust Celine's methods, though the nature of this final trial had them all on edge. They had been through a lot together, but this was different. The singularity didn't care about intuition. It didn't care about human ingenuity. It was cold, indifferent, and absolute. Celine's hands moved across the controls in fluid, practiced movements. The Astrolabe began to shift closer, approaching the outer edge of the singularity's gravitational field. The ship groaned slightly as it felt the tug, but Celine didn't flinch. She could almost hear the hum of the universe, like a heartbeat in the background. Everything around her had a rhythm, a pattern that she could almost see. The tension in the room was thick, heavy. Zenith's eyes were locked on the sensors, his mandibles clicking nervously. "This is folly," he repeated. "We're far too close." "I told you, Zenith," Celine said again, her voice calm and resolute. "Trust me. The stars don't lie." The Astrolabe passed into the outer limits of the singularity's influence, and the ship lurched forward. The pull intensified immediately. The hull creaked as though straining against the immense pressure. For a moment, Cale looked at the readouts, panic creeping into his features. We're too close," Cale said, his voice rising. "We can't hold this. The gravity's warping our trajectory." Celine didn't answer. Instead, she focused harder. She didn't have time for panic. The Astrolabe was almost inside now, the black hole's event horizon just a few clicks away. The crew could feel the immense pressure on the ship, an unnatural force pulling at them from every direction. "Steady, Kale," Celine said, her voice as calm as a whisper in the midst of the storm. "This is where we adapt." With a final deep breath, she pressed a sequence of buttons on the console. The artificial gravity flickered and adjusted slightly, shifting with the gravitational waves to keep the ship balanced. The ship groaned again, but it held steady. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, the singularity's pull began to change direction. Zenith's eyes widened. "What have you done?" he asked, voice tight with disbelief. "I've adapted," Celine said quietly. "I read the anomaly. We've passed the worst of it." The astrolabe began to glide, not away from the singularity, but around it. Celine's calculated drift kept the ship on the edge of the event horizon, where the gravitational field was stable enough to allow passage without being pulled in. The forces were still immense, but her intuition told her where to go, where to feel for the right currents. The ship's path wasn't a straight line, but a curve, a smooth arc that spiraled gently, like a leaf floating on a stream. Kale's voice, though full of awe, still carried a hint of disbelief. I don't believe it. We're not being pulled in. We're actually moving around it." Celine let herself smile. "I told you. Trust me." Zenith was silent for a moment, his expression unreadable. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower, almost respectful. I underestimated you, Captain. I admit that. But how did you know? How did you feel this?" "I didn't," Celine answered. "I just listened. The stars don't give us the answers we want, they give us the answers we need. And right now, the answer was in the pull of the singularity itself. I read it. I felt it. And that's how we're getting out." The ship continued its steady arc, the black hole no longer a threat but a passage, a test that had been passed. As they moved further away from the singularity, the tension that had built up in the room seemed to evaporate. The crew exhaled in unison, their collective breath releasing a weight they hadn't known they were carrying. Zenith moved to the side, his eyes still on the view screen, now calm, but his mind working through what he had witnessed. "I have never seen anything like that. Your species, you have a different way of seeing the universe." Celine nodded, not with arrogance, but with the quiet satisfaction of one who had succeeded. "We don't always need to see everything. Sometimes, we just need to feel it." Kale walked up beside her, his voice softer now. "Captain, we did it. We passed the trial. We're through." Celine nodded once more, a glimmer of something else, something like hope, shining in her eyes. "We're not just through, Kale. We're just beginning." The stars stretched out before them, endless and uncharted. And in the silence that followed, Celine knew that this journey was only the first step toward something far greater than any of them had yet realized.